Clara Whitcomb pressed her gloved hand flat against the cold parlor wall and told herself for the very last time that she did not care. She was 39 years old. She had stopped counting the seasons she had attended these exhibitions alone. She had stopped flinching when the whispers followed her across polished floors. But tonight, something in her chest cracked open, like old timber giving way beneath a summer storm, and she could not explain why. If this story has ever lived inside your own heart, subscribe to this channel right now. Drop the name of your city in the comments below because I want to see how far this story travels. And stay with Clara until the very end. I promise you she earns every moment of what is coming. The Boston Art Society's summer exhibition opened on the 14th of July, 1814, and every woman of consequence in the city had arrived dressed to be seen. Clara Whitcomb had arrived dressed to disappear. Her gown was pale gray silk, tasteful quiet, the color of morning fog over the harbor. Her dark hair was pinned simply at the nape of her neck. She wore no elaborate plumage, no strings of inherited pearls, none of the calculated ornamentation that the other ladies deployed like weapons before a siege. She had chosen, as she always chose, to take up as little space as possible. It was a habit she had cultivated across nearly 2 decades of being a woman the world had decided was surplus. "There she is," she heard someone murmur as she passed through the arched doorway into the main gallery. She did not look toward the voice. She had learned long ago that looking only encouraged them. Her brother Nathaniel had secured her an invitation. Reluctantly, she suspected the way he did most things on her behalf. Nathaniel Whitcomb was 34 years old, the legal steward of what remained of their father's estate in Concord, and he had made it his quiet, consistent work to remind Clara that she occupied that estate on borrowed time. "You cannot remain unmarried forever," he had told her at breakfast that morning. His tone the particular blend of concern and irritation that she had come to associate with his face at close range. "People talk, Clara. They talk about me when they talk about you." "Then let them talk about you," she had replied, reaching calmly for her tea. "You're used to the attention." He had not found that amusing. She moved now through the gallery with the practiced ease of a woman who had learned to make herself comfortable in spaces where she was not entirely welcome. She genuinely loved art. That was the truth of it, the plain, unadorned truth that had nothing to do with social positioning or the strategic display of cultivated taste. She loved the way a painter could press grief into pigment and canvas and make a stranger feel it 300 years later. She loved the argument that good art started in the chest before it ever reached the mind. She stopped before a large oil painting, a harbor scene, a ship caught mid-storm, the rigging straining against a green-black sky. The technique was extraordinary. The painter had captured something in the water that felt less like observation and more like memory. "Most people look at that one for about 4 seconds, a voice said behind her. "You've been standing there for nearly 3 minutes." Clara did not startle. She turned with the measured composure of a woman who had learned that startling gave people too much satisfaction. The man standing a few feet away was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the dark, precisely cut coat of someone who had money and the sense not to make a spectacle of it. He was perhaps 36 or 37, with a face that was more interesting than handsome, strong jaw, dark eyes set beneath a heavy brow, the kind of features that looked like they had been tested by weather and circumstance and had held their shape. He was watching her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. Not the amused condescension she was accustomed to from men of his obvious station. Something more direct than that, more genuinely curious. "I wasn't aware I was being timed," she said. "You weren't," he said. "I noticed because I was standing there myself, before you arrived." He glanced back at the painting. "I keep coming back to it. There's something in the water I can't name." "Memory," she said. And then, because she had not intended to say it aloud, and the word had simply escaped her, she felt the faint warmth of embarrassment rise in her throat. But the man only nodded slowly, as though she had confirmed something he had already suspected. "Memory," he repeated. "Yes, that's exactly it." He paused. "Nathaniel Ashford." He said it the way people said names when they expected recognition, not with arrogance, but with the quiet assumption of someone who had been introduced in enough rooms to know that the introduction generally landed with some weight. Clara recognized it, of course. The Ashford name was known across every drawing room and counting house in Boston. Ashford Shipping, Ashford Merchant Bank, the Ashford Summer Estate in Salem, which people spoke about with the reverence usually reserved for landmarks and national monuments. Nathaniel Ashford's father had built half the commercial waterfront. Nathaniel Ashford himself had by all accounts doubled it. Clara Whitcomb, she said, and offered nothing further. He waited as though expecting the usual supplementary information: whose daughter, whose sister. What prospects, what connections, and when none came, something shifted in his expression. Not offense. Something closer to interest. "You're Nathaniel Whitcomb's sister," he said. "I am," she said, "though I manage to exist independently of that fact on most days." A pause. Then, unexpectedly, he almost smiled. It was not a full smile, just a slight shift at the corner of his mouth there and gone like light-catching glass. "He's mentioned you," Ashford said. "I imagine he has," Clara said, "though I suspect the mentions were not designed to be flattering." "They weren't," Ashford agreed with a frankness that was so unexpected she nearly laughed. "He told me you were difficult." That's Nathaniel's word for women who form their own opinions. This time he did smile briefly fully, in a way that altered his face considerably. It made him look younger and somehow less armored. "What do you think of the Harlow pieces?" he asked, nodding toward a set of smaller works displayed along the eastern wall. Delicate watercolors, botanical studies rendered with extraordinary precision. "I think Margaret Harlow has been painting under her husband's name for at least 5 years, Clara said, "and that the Boston Art Society has been displaying her work while crediting him, and that everyone in this room either knows it or has decided it isn't worth knowing." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that settles when someone has said a true thing in a room accustomed to pleasant fictions. "You're certain," he said. "I've seen her preliminary sketches," Clara said. "She's a friend. Or was, before her husband decided my friendship was an inconvenient influence on her independence." Ashford looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the watercolors. "I was considering purchasing the largest one," he said. "It's beautiful," Clara said. "You should. Just be clear about whose hand made it." He turned back to her with an expression she still could not fully read, but which had in it something she recognized from rare moments in her life, the particular quality of a person paying genuine attention. "Will you walk with me through the rest of the exhibition, Miss Whitcomb?" he asked. "I find I'm seeing the work differently with you standing near it." She should have declined. She knew it even as the invitation landed. She was already aware of the way the room had shifted, the subtle recalibration of attention that happened when a woman like her stood in conversation with a man like him for longer than a few polite exchanges. She could feel eyes moving toward them from the periphery, assessments being made, stories beginning to form in the minds of people who had nothing better to do with their evening than construct narratives about other people's lives. She was 39 years old. She was unmarried. She owned no property in her own right. She had no significant fortune, no powerful family connections, no beauty that had ever arrested a room. She was by every measure the city of Boston applied to women, a figure of mild pity and quiet irrelevance. "Yes," she said. "I'll walk with you." They moved through the gallery together, and what struck her, what she would remember later, lying awake in her narrow room at the Concord estate, with the summer night pressing warm against the window, was not the art they discussed, though they discussed it with a depth and pleasure that she had not experienced in any social exchange in recent memory. What struck her was the way he listened, not the performance of listening that she had grown accustomed to from men of his class, the slight lean forward, the occasional murmur of agreement, the eyes that wandered to more interesting prospects over her shoulder. He listened the way her father had listened when she was a girl, and her father was still alive, and the world had not yet sorted her into the category of women who could be safely ignored. He listened as though what she said was the thing he had come to the exhibition to hear. They stopped before a portrait, a woman in her middle years, dark-haired, with a composure that the painter had rendered with obvious respect. The subject was not young. She was not conventionally beautiful. But the painter had found in her face something that made the canvas feel more substantial than the gilded frame around it. "Who is she?" Ashford asked. "I don't know," Clara said. "She's not labeled, but whoever she was, the painter loved her. You can see it in the way he handled her hands." Ashford studied the portrait for a long moment. "She looks like someone who has decided to stop apologizing for taking up space," he said quietly. Clara felt the words land somewhere in her sternum and stay there. "Yes," she said. "She does." They were standing close, not improperly, so but close enough that she was aware of it, aware of the warmth of another person nearby, in a way she had grown so unused to that it felt almost foreign. She could hear the distant murmur of other conversations across the gallery, the soft percussion of footsteps on marble, the occasional bright note of laughter from a cluster of young women near the entrance, who were doing what young women did at these events, performing effortless delight while calculating carefully. "May I ask you something, Miss Whitcomb?" Ashford said. "You may," she said. "Your brother told me you refused an offer of marriage 3 years ago. A respectable man," he said. "Good family, adequate income." He paused. He seemed to find the refusal inexplicable. Clara considered the question, not whether to answer it, but how. She was not accustomed to men asking about her choices with anything other than judgment already assembled and waiting. "The man in question," she said carefully, "was a good man in most respects. But he wanted a housekeeper who would sign a legal document first. He wasn't interested in a partner. He was interested in a woman who would be grateful enough for his name to forget that she had one of her own." Ashford was quiet for a moment. "And you weren't grateful enough." "I was grateful for many things in my life," she said. "I have simply never been able to manufacture gratitude for being underestimated." He turned to look at her directly. Then fully, without the slight social angle that people usually maintained in these conversations, as though looking too straight at another person was a vulnerability they couldn't afford. "I owe you a candor in return," he said. "My own situation is this: I am 37 years old. I have been presented with, by my mother's count, 14 eligible women over the past 4 years. Each one was accomplished, well-connected, and entirely prepared to be Mrs. Ashford, in the way that the role has always been performed. And I have found each time that I could not make myself want what was being offered." Clara studied him. "What is it you found yourself wanting?" she asked. He looked back at the portrait of the unnamed woman with the composed hands. "A conversation," he said simply. "A real one, the kind where both people are actually present." The gallery was thinning. The evening had run long, and the crowd was drifting toward the doors, toward waiting carriages, and the comfortable performances of their ordinary lives. Clara was aware that her brother would be looking for her, aware too that being found in extended conversation with Nathaniel Ashford would produce a particular quality of interrogation on the carriage ride home that she was not eager to endure. "I should find my brother," she said. "Of course," Ashford said. He paused, then reached into his coat and produced a small card, plain well made, his name engraved in clean, simple letters. "I would very much like to continue this conversation, Miss Whitcomb, if you're willing." She took the card. It was the kind of gesture she had received perhaps twice in her adult life, and both previous times it had come from men whose interest lasted precisely as long as it took for a more conventional prospect to enter the room. She looked at the card in her gloved hand. Then she looked at him. "Why?" she asked, not coyly, not with false modesty, directly, because she was 39 years old, and she had run out of patience for indirection a very long time ago. He did not flinch from the question. "Because," he said, "you are the first person I have spoken to in this city in 4 years who made me forget even briefly that I was supposed to be performing a role. And that is not something I am willing to walk away from without at least trying to understand it." Clara Whitcomb stood in the thinning gallery with a man's card in her gloved hand and a crack spreading quietly through the wall she had spent 2 decades building around herself. She did not know yet what it would cost her when that wall finally came down. She did not know what her brother would do when he found out. She did not know that Nathaniel Ashford had that very morning been presented by his mother with an ultimatum that he would announce his engagement by the end of the summer, or find himself managing his inheritance from a position considerably less comfortable than the one he currently occupied. She knew none of it. She only knew that she tucked the card into her small reticule, bid him good evening with a composure she was proud of, and walked toward the gallery doors feeling for the first time in longer than she could honestly remember, like a woman whose story was not yet finished. The card stayed in her reticule for 3 days before Clara allowed herself to look at it again. She had not meant to keep it that long without deciding what to do with it. That was what she told herself anyway, that the delay was practical, not emotional, that she was simply a woman with a full schedule who had not yet found the appropriate moment to sit down and think clearly about what Nathaniel Ashford's card meant, if it meant anything at all. But on the third morning, while her brother was out riding and the house was quiet, she took it out and set it on the writing desk in the small room that served as her private library, and she looked at it for a long time. The engraving was clean and unadorned. Just his name. No title of particular grandeur, no list of affiliations or commercial enterprises, though he could have filled a page with them. Just Nathaniel Ashford. And below it, an address in Salem. She turned the card over. Nothing on the back. It was such a small, plain thing to have lodged itself so thoroughly in the back of her mind. She was still sitting there when her Aunt Abigail appeared in the doorway. Her father's elder sister, 62 years old, with the sharp eyes of a woman who had made it her life's work to observe the people around her, and the careful tongue of one who had learned over many decades precisely when to deploy what she observed. "You've been staring at that desk for 20 minutes, Aunt Abigail said, settling herself into the chair across from Clara with the deliberate ease of someone who intended to stay. "What's on it that's so interesting?" Clara closed her hand over the card. Not quickly, she was too composed for that, but firmly. "Nothing of consequence," she said. Aunt Abigail looked at her hand, then at her face. Then she made the small sound in the back of her throat that meant she had already arrived at a conclusion and was simply waiting for Clara to catch up. "Nathaniel came home from that exhibition very flustered," she said. "He didn't say why, but he kept asking questions about the Ashford family at supper. Subtle questions, which is to say, not subtle at all." Clara said nothing. "He wanted to know," Aunt Abigail continued pleasantly, "whether you'd spoken to anyone of consequence at the event. I told him I didn't have the faintest idea as I wasn't there. But he looked the way he looks when something has happened that he hasn't been able to control." She paused. "He looked like your father used to look when you'd done something unexpected." "I had a conversation," Clara said, "with Mr. Ashford about the paintings." Aunt Abigail was quiet for a moment. "Nathaniel Ashford?" "Yes." Another quiet moment. "And he gave you his card?" Clara opened her hand and looked at it again. "Yes." Her aunt reached forward, took the card from her fingers, examined it briefly, and set it back down on the desk with the manner of someone returning a piece of evidence at a hearing. "He's been trying to buy the Whitcomb land in Concord," Aunt Abigail said. "Your brother's been negotiating with him for 6 months. Did you know that?" Clara felt the information land with a dull, cold precision. "No," she said. "I did not know that." "Your brother didn't mention it." Aunt Abigail's voice carried no particular judgment, only the particular quality of information being placed carefully in front of someone who needed to have it. "He's been very quiet about the whole matter. The Ashford family wants the eastern acreage for a mill project, apparently. It's a significant sum." Clara stared at the card on the desk. "You're wondering," she said slowly, "whether Mr. Ashford's interest in conversation with me has anything to do with a business negotiation with my brother." "I'm not wondering anything," Aunt Abigail said. "I'm simply making sure you have the full picture before you decide what the picture means." That was the thing about Aunt Abigail. She never told Clara what to think. She only ever made certain Clara had what she needed to think clearly. It was the most useful kind of love, and also at moments like this, the most uncomfortable. Clara looked at the card for another long moment. Then she picked it up, crossed the room to her small writing desk, and sat down. "Would you like some tea?" she asked. "I would love some tea," Aunt Abigail said, settling back in her chair. "Take your time." Clara wrote 2 drafts before she was satisfied. The first was too cautious, too full of qualifications that telegraphed how much she was trying not to want the thing she was considering. The second was better direct, brief, appropriately formal, and entirely non-committal about what she expected in return. She wrote that she had given further thought to his invitation for conversation, that she would be attending the Harlow benefit at the Tremont Street Gallery the following Thursday, and that she would be there from 4 o'clock until 6 if he happened to find himself in the vicinity. She sent it before she could change her mind. The reply came the next morning. It was brief. He would be there at 4. She read those 5 words, standing in the front hall with the folded note in her hand, and she felt something move in her chest that she recognized distantly as the particular feeling of a person who has done something irreversible and is still deciding whether they're glad. She did not tell her brother. She told Aunt Abigail, because not telling Aunt Abigail things had never once worked in her favor. Her aunt listened, asked 2 pointed questions: was she going alone? And had she given any thought to what she would say to Nathaniel if he noticed her absence on Thursday afternoon, and then declared the plan perfectly reasonable and offered to accompany her. "You don't need a chaperone," Aunt Abigail added. "You need a witness. There's a difference." Thursday came with the particular brightness of a July afternoon that makes everything seem slightly more consequential than it would in ordinary weather. Clara arrived at the Tremont Street Gallery precisely at 4 and spent the first 11 minutes telling herself with impressive conviction that there was a perfectly good chance he would not come, that she had built nothing on this, that her expectations were appropriately minimal. At 4:12, Nathaniel Ashford walked through the door. He found her almost immediately, or perhaps she was simply the person he had come looking for, which was its own unsettling fact. He was dressed with the same quiet precision she had noticed at the exhibition. He moved through the room without any of the performance she had learned to expect from men of his position, without the slight pause at the entrance that said, "Look here, I have arrived." He simply came in and crossed the room and said her name quietly in greeting, and the ordinariness of it was somehow more disarming than any grand gesture could have been. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, "thank you for writing." "Thank you for answering," she said. They stood there for a moment, 2 people who had arranged to be in the same room and were now navigating the particular awkwardness of the fact that they had done so deliberately. "I should tell you something before we go any further," Clara said. Because she had decided in the 3 days between receiving his card and sending her note, and the 4 days between sending her note and this moment, that she was too old and too clear-eyed to start something built on a foundation she hadn't first examined. "All right," he said. He said it without wariness, which she noted. "I know about the conquered land," she said. "The negotiation with my brother, the eastern acreage." Something moved across his face. Not guilt precisely, but recognition. The look of a man who has calculated the timing of a collision and finds it has arrived somewhat ahead of schedule. "I see," he said. "I'm not accusing you of anything," Clara said. "I simply want to be clear that I am aware of it, and that if your interest in my company is in any way connected to a desire to smooth a business transaction with my brother, I would rather know that plainly than discover it later." She held his gaze while she said it. She had rehearsed the words, but they still cost her something to deliver, not because she was uncertain of them, but because saying them meant acknowledging that she had something she was afraid to lose. He was quiet for a long moment. "The negotiation with your brother has been ongoing for 6 months, he said. "It has nothing to do with you. You were not part of my thinking when I approached him, and you were not part of my thinking when I crossed the room at the exhibition." He paused. "I realize I have no way of proving that to you." "No," Clara agreed. "You don't." "Then I suppose," he said carefully, "the question is whether you're willing to see what develops with that uncertainty in place, or whether the uncertainty is too much." It was such a direct, unornamented thing to say that she took a breath before answering. "I've spent 20 years living with uncertainty," she said. "It doesn't frighten me. Dishonesty does." He nodded slowly. "Then I'll make you a single promise. Whatever happens between us, if anything does, it will always be the truth. I don't know how to give you certainty, but I can give you honesty." Clara studied him. "That," she said quietly, is more than most people have offered me." They walked through the gallery for 2 hours. Aunt Abigail positioned herself near the refreshment table at a distance that was simultaneously respectable and extremely attentive. Clara was aware of her aunt's presence, the way one is aware of a benevolent sentry, comforting and slightly nerve-wracking in equal measure. What she discovered across those 2 hours was that Nathaniel Ashford was a man who had opinions and was willing to be wrong about them. He disagreed with her about the merit of the newest landscape series. He found it technically accomplished, but emotionally cold. She found it deliberately restrained in a way she respected, and he argued his position with enough conviction to be interesting and enough flexibility to actually hear her counter. At one point, she said something that reversed his reading of a particular piece entirely, and he stood there for a moment in silence and then said simply, "Yes, that's right. I was wrong about it." She could not remember the last time a man had said those words to her without following them immediately with a however. When they parted at 6 o'clock on the gallery steps, with Aunt Abigail descending toward their waiting carriage at a discreet few paces, he asked if she would be willing to meet again. "There's a private collection on Beacon Hill," he said. "A friend of mine, Harrison Wells, has recently acquired a set of Federal-era portraits that I think you would find interesting. He's offered to open the house to a small group next Saturday. I could arrange an invitation for you and your aunt if you're willing." Private invitation. Smaller gathering. His friend's home. Clara felt the stakes shift incrementally, a social degree more significant, a step further in from the public neutrality of a gallery event. "I'll need to think about it," she said. "Of course," he said. He tipped his hat, a slight, genuine gesture, not performative. "Good evening, Miss Whitcomb." She thought about it for exactly 48 hours. Then she sent a note saying yes. What she did not anticipate was that her brother would find out. Nathaniel Whitcomb appeared in the library doorway on the morning before the Saturday gathering, and she knew from the set of his jaw that someone had told him something. Her brother had many qualities, but concealment was not among them. His face had always been a clear transcript of whatever was occurring behind it. "I heard," he said, "that you've been seen twice now in company with Nathaniel Ashford." "I've been seen twice in public, yes," Clara said, setting down the book she'd been reading with the calm deliberateness of a woman who is not going to be made to feel she has done something wrong. "At the Tremont Street Gallery, and before that at the Art Society exhibition. Both perfectly respectable occasions." "He's a business associate," Nathaniel said. "Do you understand what that means?" "It means he's a man you do business with," Clara said. "It doesn't mean he's your property." Her brother's jaw tightened. "I don't want complications." "I'm not a complication, Nathaniel. I'm your sister." "In this instance," he said, and his voice carried the particular cold precision of someone who has decided to deploy a weapon, "you're both." He stepped further into the room. "The Ashford negotiation is at a delicate stage. I cannot have him distracted or confused about what the relationship between our families is and isn't." Clara put down her book entirely now. "What exactly," she said very quietly, "are you afraid he's going to think I'm afraid?" Nathaniel said that he is going to think you are available, that there is some arrangement to be made, and I am not in a position to have the terms of my negotiation complicated by his personal interests. The silence in the room had a particular quality after that, the kind that arrives when someone has said something they cannot unsay, and both parties know it. "You're afraid," Clara said, "that he might want to marry me, and that this would somehow damage your business negotiation." Nathaniel did not answer, which was its own kind of answer. "I want you to stop seeing him," he said. Clara stood up. She was not a tall woman, and her brother was considerably larger than she was, and none of that mattered in the slightest in that moment. "No," she said. He blinked. He had not, she suspected, actually expected that word. "Clara." "No," she said again. "I am 39 years old. I have lived in this house on your sufferance since Father died. I have made myself small and quiet and convenient for your comfort for 15 years. I have turned down one offer of marriage because it would have made me less than I am, And I have waited. I have waited a very long time, Nathaniel, for someone who might see me as a full person rather than a decorative liability." Her voice was steady. She had not raised it. She would not raise it. "I am going to the Wells house on Saturday. You can handle your own business negotiation." She walked past him, out of the library before he could find an answer. Her heart was hammering so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Her hands, she noticed as she reached the hallway, were trembling very slightly. She pressed them flat against the wall, the same gesture she had made in the parlor on the night of the exhibition, and held them there until they steadied. Aunt Abigail materialized from the direction of the sitting room with the uncanny timing she had always possessed in moments of family crisis. "I heard," she said simply. "I know you did," Clara said. "You did well," Aunt Abigail said. "You held your ground without cruelty. That's the harder thing." Clara leaned her head back against the wall and looked at the ceiling. "What if Nathaniel is right?" she said. "What if Ashford's interest has more to do with the land than with me, and I've just humiliated myself in my brother's library for nothing?" "Then you'll have the dignity of having spoken your truth," Aunt Abigail said. "And the knowledge that you didn't let fear make you small. That's not nothing, Clara. That's everything." Saturday came. Harrison Wells's house on Beacon Hill was everything Nathaniel Ashford's world occupied. Old money quiet, confidence rooms full of things that had been chosen with actual care. The small gathering was perhaps 12 people. Clara recognized 2 of them from the Art Society, nodded to both, and felt the familiar low frequency of social attention calibrating toward her as she entered with Aunt Abigail on her arm. Ashford was already there. He crossed to meet her within a minute of her arrival. "I'm glad you came," he said. "So am I," she said, which was truer than she had expected to say. They were 3 rooms into the portrait collection when Harrison Wells appeared at Ashford's elbow, a compact, energetic man of about 40, with an open face and the manner of someone perpetually pleased to be exactly where he is. "Nathaniel tells me you have extraordinary instincts about Federal-era composition," Wells said to Clara, with the comfortable directness of a man who doesn't have time for a long preamble. "Nathaniel is generous," Clara said, and glanced at Ashford, who looked very slightly caught. "He said," Wells continued, apparently delighted, "that you identified a probable misattribution at the Art Society exhibition inside of 90 seconds. "The Margaret Harlow pieces," Clara said. "Yes. I have 2 portraits in the back room that I'd like your opinion on," Wells said. "I acquired them last spring, and I've had 2 different experts give me 2 completely different readings of the provenance." For the next 40 minutes, Clara stood in Harrison Wells' back gallery with 2 men who listened to every word she said. Not indulgently. Not with the particular strained courtesy of men waiting for a woman to finish so they could explain things properly. They listened, and they pushed back, and they asked follow-up questions, and they wrote down the name of the reference she cited from memory. At the end of it, Wells turned to Ashford and said, "You were right about her." Ashford looked at Clara. "I know," he said. She felt that land somewhere in her chest and stay there. Walking back through the main gallery afterward, Ashford fell into step beside her while Aunt Abigail drifted strategically toward the refreshments. "Your brother came to see me yesterday morning," he said without preamble. Clara stopped walking. "I thought he might," she said carefully. "He asked me," Ashford said in an even, measured tone, "to limit my social contact with you, for the sake of the business negotiation." He framed it as a concern about mixed signals. The familiar cold clarity of anticipated betrayal moved through her chest. She had half expected it. She had prepared herself for it. It still arrived with a weight that took her breath slightly. "And what did you tell him?" she asked. Ashford looked at her directly. "I told him that my business negotiations and my personal choices are conducted separately and that I intended to keep it that way. I told him the land deal would proceed, or it wouldn't on its own merits, and that his sister was not a variable in that equation." Clara held herself very still. "He wasn't pleased," Ashford continued. "He made some remarks about your situation that I found." He paused, choosing the word with visible care. "Unkind. I won't repeat them." "You don't need to," Clara said. I know what he thinks of my situation. I want you to know, Ashford said, that what he thinks of it and what I think of it are not the same thing. She looked at him. The afternoon light through the tall windows caught the angles of his face in a way that made him look for a moment very much like a man who was telling the truth. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because he said I promised you honesty. And because I think you've spent long enough having other people's assessments of your worth delivered to you as if they were facts." He paused. "They're not facts, Miss Whitcomb. They're failures of perception." Something happened in her chest that she was not prepared for. Not the soft, romantic shift she had once imagined love might feel like when she was young enough to imagine such things. This was harder and more specific than that. This was the feeling of a door opening in a room she had locked years ago and told herself she didn't miss. She pressed her hand once briefly against her collarbone. Then she lowered it. "You should know," she said, her voice very steady, "that I am not an easy woman to know. I have opinions and I hold them. I don't perform pleasantness when I don't feel it. I've been told that these qualities make me—" She paused, difficult. "I know," he said. "Your brother told me." And bowed. He said, "I have been surrounded my entire adult life by people performing pleasantness they don't feel. I find it exhausting. I find you—" He stopped, considered, then continued. "The opposite of exhausting." Clara Whitcomb stood in Harrison Wells's portrait gallery and looked at the man in front of her, and she felt, underneath the caution, underneath the old scar tissue of years of being told she was too much and not enough. Simultaneously, the very first tremor of something she had stopped letting herself name. She did not name it now, but she felt it, and she did not push it away. "I think," she said quietly, "that I would like to have another conversation with you. I think," he said, "that I would like to have a great many more of them." She nodded once, then she turned back toward the portraits, and they stood side by side in the quiet afternoon. Two people standing at the edge of something neither of them had quite found words for yet. Across the room, Aunt Abigail watched them over the rim of her teacup and said nothing at all. But she was smiling, and 2 streets away in a counting house near the waterfront, Nathaniel Whitcomb was drafting a letter he had no business writing, one that if it reached its intended recipient would threaten to take apart everything his sister had only just allowed herself to begin wanting. The letter Nathaniel Whitcomb sent reached Ashford House on a Monday morning. Clara did not know about it until Wednesday. And she only found out then because Aunt Abigail had a long-standing friendship with Dorothea Wells, Harrison Wells's mother, and Dorothea Wells had the particular gift of knowing everything that moved through Boston society approximately 3 days before anyone else did. Aunt Abigail came to Clara's room on Wednesday evening and sat down without being invited, which she only did when the news was serious enough that comfort needed to arrive before the information did. "Your brother wrote to Nathaniel Ashford," she said. Clara set down her book. "When?" "Monday. Dorothea heard it from her son, who heard it from Ashford himself." Aunt Abigail's hands were folded in her lap with the deliberate stillness of someone managing their own reaction carefully. "He told Ashford that you have a history of emotional instability, that you refused your previous offer of marriage because of an irrational attachment to a man who had already rejected you, that the family has been concerned about your," she paused, "increasingly erratic behavior since your father's death." The room was very quiet. Clara heard her own breathing measured and slow because she would not allow it to be anything else. "He invented it," she said. Her voice was flat. Not because she was not feeling anything, but because she was feeling too many things simultaneously, and none of them had found a shape yet. "Yes," Aunt Abigail said. "He invented it." "The man who rejected me," Clara said. "Did Nathaniel name him?" "He did not. He was careful enough not to make it verifiable." Aunt Abigail's jaw was tight. "He was careful about all of it. Nothing outright false enough to be disproven easily. Everything angled to make Ashford question your steadiness." Clara stood up. She walked to the window. She stood there with her back to her aunt and her hand pressed flat against the wooden frame, which was the only outlet she allowed herself. 15 years. 15 years she had lived quietly in this house, made herself useful. asked for nothing beyond the basic dignity of being treated as a person with interior life and legitimate feeling. She had swallowed objections. She had smoothed over conflicts. She had managed her own grief at her father's death while simultaneously managing her brother's household through it. She had done all of it without complaint because complaint had never gotten her anywhere, and she had been practical enough to understand that. And he had taken all of that, taken her composure, her patience, her determined smallness, and used it to build a lie about her that he had then mailed to the one man in 15 years who had looked at her like she was worth knowing. "Does Ashford believe it?" she asked. "We don't know," Aunt Abigail said. "Dorothea only knows that he received it, not how he responded to it." Clara turned around. "I need to know," she said. "I know you do," Aunt Abigail said. "The question is how." The answer came as answers sometimes did, before Clara had fully finished working out the question. The following morning, a note arrived. Brief in Ashford's handwriting, which she recognized now from his previous correspondence. It said, "I received a letter from your brother. I would like to speak with you about it directly if you're willing. I'll be at the Addicts Coffee House on State Street tomorrow at 10 o'clock if that suits you. You needn't come if you'd rather not. But I hope you will." She read it 3 times. Then she set it on the desk and looked at it the way she had looked at his card in the beginning, trying to read what was underneath the words, trying to determine whether what was coming would be the thing she feared, or something else entirely. The something else was what frightened her more, she realized. She had built very good defenses against disappointment. She had no defenses at all against hope. She went. Ashford was there before her, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. He stood when he saw her, which was the kind of small, consistent courtesy she had noticed about him, not performed for an audience, just the way he operated. He waited until she had settled across from him before he sat back down. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Thank you for asking directly," she said, rather than simply withdrawing. Something moved across his face. "Is that what you expected me to do?" "It's what most people do," she said carefully, "when someone presents them with a reason to reconsider." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up. "Your brother's letter said you have a history of instability, that you refused your previous engagement out of an irrational attachment to another man, that the family has been managing your, I'll use his word, episode since your father's death." He said it plainly, with no embellishment, the way you read someone their own charges. "I want to hear your account." Clara held his gaze. "There is no other man," she said. "There never was. I refused the previous offer because the man in question made it clear that he wanted a woman who would be grateful enough for his name to become invisible behind it. I was not willing to become invisible." She paused. "The rest is invention. My brother is afraid that my relationship with you complicates his negotiation. He told me so himself in the library 10 days ago. When I refused to stop seeing you, he found another method." Ashford listened to every word. He did not interrupt. He did not react in the ways she had braced for, the slight narrowing of eyes that meant a man is looking for evidence of instability in real time, the careful neutrality that means he has already decided and is waiting for the conversation to conclude. He looked like a man doing the harder thing, listening and withholding judgment simultaneously. "Why did he want you to stop seeing me?" he asked. "He believes," Clara said, "that if you develop a personal attachment to me, it will complicate the business terms. He thinks you might feel obligated to be generous, or he thinks you might withdraw entirely rather than navigate the situation. Either way, he loses control of the transaction." "He told you this?" "He implied it with enough clarity that no telling was required," she said. "My brother is not a subtle man. He never has been." Ashford set down his coffee cup. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear it without immediately looking for the angle in it, because I know that's your instinct, and I understand why, but I need you to try." Clara felt the muscles across her shoulders tighten slightly. "All right. When I received your brother's letter," Ashford said, "my first feeling was not doubt. It was anger, not at you, at him. He looked at her steadily. Because it was transparent enough that a man who had spoken to you twice for a combined total of perhaps 4 hours could see it was transparent. And that means he wrote it assuming I would believe it simply because it came from a man about a woman. He assumed the accusation would carry more weight than the person. Clara sat very still. He was wrong, Ashford said. She pressed her lips together briefly. You can't know me from 4 hours, she said, because she had to say it. Because fairness demanded it even when fairness was inconvenient. You can believe I'm telling the truth now without actually knowing whether I am. That's correct, he said. But I know what a person looks like when they're telling the truth, and I know what a letter looks like when it's been written to serve the writer rather than inform the reader. Your brother's letter was the second kind. He paused. And I know Miss Whitcomb. I know what you sound like when you're thinking. You don't perform. You don't manage your presentation the way people do when they're concealing something. You say the thing that's actually in your head. That is not a quality that coexists comfortably with the behavior your brother described. The coffee house had a low murmur of other conversations around them. Clara was aware of it distantly, the way you're aware of weather outside a window when you're focused on something inside the room. What do you intend to do about the land negotiation? She asked. Continue it, he said, on the same terms as before. Your brother's personal conduct toward you doesn't alter the merits of the business arrangement, and I don't punish people through their siblings. He looked at her very directly. I want to be clear, I'm not continuing the negotiation as a favor to you. I'm continuing it because it's a fair deal and his behavior is his business to own. He won't see it that way, Clara said. He'll think you're doing it because of me. It will make him more anxious, not less. Probably, Ashford agreed. And that doesn't concern you. Miss Whitcomb, he said, and there was something in his voice that had shifted something quieter and more direct. What concerns me considerably more than your brother's anxiety is the possibility that you will decide this is all too complicated and withdraw. That is the thing I'm actually worried about. Clara looked at him across the small table and felt the door from Wells's portrait gallery creak further open, throwing more light into the room she'd kept locked. She didn't say anything for a long moment. I don't withdraw easily, she said finally. It's not really my nature. Good, he said, simply and without embellishment. They sat together for another hour. They talked not about her brother, not about the land, not about any of the machinery of social and commercial pressure surrounding them. They talked about her father because she mentioned him once, and Ashford asked a question, and then she found herself talking about him with a fluency and ease that surprised her, because she almost never talked about him at all. She talked about the way he had argued with her about books when she was 14, and how he had never once in her memory told her that her opinions were too large for a girl to hold. She talked about losing him to fever 6 years past, and the particular quality of grief that came with losing the only person who had consistently seen you clearly. Ashford listened to all of it. And then he told her about his own father, not the legend, not the commercial empire, but the actual man who had been demanding and exacting and profoundly difficult to love, and who had died when Ashford was 29, leaving him a fortune and an instruction manual for life that Ashford had been quietly revising ever since. He told me, Ashford said with the careful tone of someone quoting something they've had to make peace with, that sentiment was a luxury a serious man couldn't afford. That attachment was a liability. He paused. He married my mother for strategic reasons, and they were civil to each other for 40 years, and I watched that and decided very young that I would not do the same thing. And yet, Clara said, here you are, 37 years old and unmarried. Here I am, he agreed. 37 years old, and having found in the space of 3 weeks more genuine conversation than I've had in the previous 4 years. She felt heat rise briefly in her face. She did not look away. I'm afraid, she said. She said it flatly, the way she'd learned to say hard things, not dramatically, not with apology, but clearly because clarity was the only kind of honesty she could fully respect. I've been invisible for a long time. I've made my peace with it. And now you are seeing me, and I don't know what to do with that. I don't know how to trust it. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to trust it yet. I'm asking you to stay in the room long enough to find out whether it's trustworthy." She nodded once, slowly. "I can do that," she said. What happened next came from a direction neither of them anticipated. 3 days after the coffeehouse conversation, Clara received a visitor she had not been expecting. She came to the front parlor to find a woman seated across from Aunt Abigail. A woman of perhaps 50, beautifully dressed, with a posture that communicated generations of practiced authority, and eyes that assessed the room with the efficient speed of someone accustomed to making rapid determinations about people. It was Eleanor Ashford, Nathaniel Ashford's mother. Clara stopped in the doorway. Eleanor Ashford rose and extended her hand with the smooth courtesy of a woman who has spent 50 years moving through rooms that were not always comfortable and has never once allowed the discomfort to show. "Miss Whitcomb," she said, "forgive the informality of an unannounced call. I'm not generally given to unannounced calls, but I find myself in a situation that required directness." Clara shook her hand. "Please sit down, Mrs. Ashford." They sat. Aunt Abigail remained in her chair with the alert stillness of a woman who is not going anywhere. "I'll be plain with you," Eleanor Ashford said. "I understand my son has been spending time in your company. I also understand that you are Nathaniel Whitcomb's sister, and that the Whitcomb land is currently under negotiation." She folded her hands. "I want to know what your intentions are." Clara felt the question land like a stone in still water. She let the ripples settle before she answered. "I would gently suggest," she said, "that the more relevant question is what your son's intentions are, as he is the party with both the social and financial capacity to act in this situation. But since you've asked, my intention is to continue an honest acquaintance with a man I find worth knowing, and to let the rest develop as it will." Eleanor Ashford studied her with those rapid assessment eyes. "My son has an obligation this summer to reach an understanding with a suitable partner. He has been avoiding that obligation for 4 years. I am not prepared to watch him avoid it for a 5th. "Then I suggest," Clara said evenly, "that you speak to your son, not to me." A silence. Then, unexpectedly, Eleanor Ashford made a sound that was almost a short laugh. "Your brother told me you were difficult," she said. "My brother tells everyone that," Clara said. "It's his word for women who have opinions." Eleanor Ashford looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Aunt Abigail, who returned the look with perfect serenity. "Do you love my son?" Eleanor asked, bluntly, completely without preamble. The room contracted. Clara took a slow breath. "I barely know your son," she said. "I have spoken with him on 4 occasions. What I can tell you is that I respect him, that I find him honest in a world where honesty is not common, and that he is the first person in a very long time who has made me feel that my presence in a room constitutes something more than a social inconvenience." She paused. "Whether that becomes love, I cannot tell you yet. But it is not nothing, and I will not diminish it to make anyone more comfortable." Another silence, longer this time. Eleanor Ashford rose. "My son is hosting a gathering at the Salem estate in 3 weeks. A small party, 10 days in duration, for close friends and family." She picked up her gloves from the side table. "He has not yet sent your invitation because he was uncertain whether you would find the suggestion premature." She looked at Clara directly. "I'm telling you this because I'd rather you have the information than not. What you do with it is your own business." She nodded to Aunt Abigail. Then she walked out of the parlor, and they heard the front door close behind her. Aunt Abigail turned to Clara. Clara looked at the door. "She came to dissuade me," Clara said slowly, "and left having given me information instead." "She came to assess you," Aunt Abigail said, "and left having decided you passed." Clara sat with that for a moment. "Or," she said, "she wants to be certain she had no role in what's about to go wrong." "Possibly both," Aunt Abigail said. The invitation from Ashford arrived 2 days later, handwritten not through a secretary. 10 days at the Salem estate, beginning the 1st of August. He named the guests Harrison Wells and his wife, 2 of his cousins, and their families his mother. And at the bottom, In his clear, unornamented handwriting, "I want to be honest with you about what this invitation represents. Bringing you to Salem means making a statement that Boston will read clearly. I am not asking you to make that statement if it feels like more than you're ready for. But I am asking because I would like you there. Whatever you decide, I'll understand." Clara read it twice. Then she read the last two sentences again. He was giving her the choice. Not the performance of a choice, the actual one. He was telling her what it cost and letting her decide whether to pay it. She sat at her writing desk with the letter in her hand and the summer heat pressing through the open window and the distant sound of her brother moving through the house below. She thought about what it would mean to go, the talk it would generate, the declaration it represented, the risk that everything she had allowed herself to begin wanting could still collapse through his mother's opposition, through her brother's interference, through the simple, terrible possibility that she had misread him entirely. And he was a man capable of a sincerity that didn't survive contact with social pressure. She thought about all of it. Then she thought about the portrait gallery, about the unnamed woman with the composed hands, about a man standing in front of a storm painting saying the word memory like she had answered something he'd been asking for years. She dipped her pen. She wrote, "Yes, I'll come." She sealed it before she could think again. She did not tell her brother. He found out 4 days later from a mutual acquaintance who had somehow already heard, because Boston was the kind of city where the speed of social information was inversely proportional to the desire of the people involved to control it. Nathaniel appeared in the library doorway at 8 in the morning, which meant he had been sitting on the knowledge since the previous evening and had spent the night manufacturing the precise composition of his fury. "You're going to Salem," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "To his estate." "Yes." "With his mother and his friends and the full understanding of every person in Boston that you are." He stopped. "That he is." He stopped again. "Do you understand what this looks like?" "It looks," Clara said, "like a woman accepting a genuine invitation from a man who respects her enough to explain what it means before asking." "It looks like desperation," he said, and his voice was cruel in the specific way it got when he was frightened. "It looks like a woman of 39 throwing herself at the first man who paid her a compliment. Nathaniel." Her voice was quiet, completely steady. "Do not say the next thing you're thinking of saying." He heard something in her tone that stopped him. Something that had not been there before, or perhaps something that had always been there, and he had never until now been made to reckon with it. "You wrote a letter to him," Clara said. "You invented a history of instability and an imaginary attachment, and you mailed it to a man you hoped would believe it because it came from you and not from me. You did that. And you are standing in this room now trying to make me feel ashamed of accepting a dinner invitation." He said nothing. "I'm going to Salem," Clara said, "and when I come back we are going to have a very different conversation about what my life in this house looks like going forward. But right now I have letters to write and a trunk to pack, and I need you to get out of my library." Nathaniel Whitcomb stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he left. Clara sat down at her desk, smoothed the paper in front of her, and picked up her pen. Her hand was not trembling. That she thought was new. She did not know yet that Nathaniel had already sent a second letter not to Ashford this time, but to a man named Cornelius Brand, a merchant with old commercial ties to the Ashford family, and a long memory for leverage. She did not know that Brand had a piece of information about the Ashford land acquisition that he had been holding in reserve for exactly the right moment. She did not know that the right moment, in Cornelius Brand's estimation, was approximately 10 days from now. She did not know that Salem was not the safe harbor she imagined it might be. She was folding her letter, pressing the wax seal flat, with the steady hand of a woman who had made her choice, and she was for the first time in 15 years not afraid of what came next. That was the most dangerous thing of all. The Salem estate was everything Clara had told herself not to expect. Not because it was grand, though it was quietly in the way of things that don't need to announce themselves, but because from the moment she arrived, Nathaniel Ashford treated her presence there as entirely natural. Not as a statement, not as a calculated social move. simply as the presence of a person he was glad to have near. That was the thing she hadn't been prepared for. Not the estate, not his mother's watchful civility, not the careful social navigation of 10 days among people who were assessing her with varying degrees of subtlety. She had prepared for all of those. What she had not prepared for was the plain, uncomplicated warmth of being welcomed somewhere by someone who meant it. Harrison Wells and his wife Margaret arrived the same afternoon. Margaret Wells was 32, quick-minded, with the kind of laugh that arrived without warning and made everyone in the room feel they'd said something funnier than they knew. She attached herself to Clara within the first hour with the cheerful determination of a woman who has decided she likes someone and sees no reason to take the long way to friendship. "Nathaniel has talked about you," Margaret said, walking beside her through the house on the informal first evening tour that Eleanor Ashford conducted for the assembled guests. "I'm aware he talks about me," Clara said dryly. "The question is always which things." Margaret laughed. "The good things. Embarrassingly specific good things, actually, which, from Nathaniel Ashford, is practically a declaration of well." She stopped herself, eyes bright. "Forgive me, I'm told I move too fast." "I find I prefer it," Clara said. The first 3 days were the best 3 days Clara could remember in recent years. The gathering was small enough that it never felt like a performance meals around a table where conversation moved freely. Afternoons organized loosely around the interests of whoever was present, evenings that wound down gradually without the sharp formality of a scheduled social event. Ashford's cousins were easy company. His mother maintained her watchful civility and occasionally said something so precisely observed about a shared topic that Clara found herself startled into genuine admiration. And Ashford himself was different here. Not different in character, but different in texture. In Boston, she had seen him in the careful posture of a man managing his public presentation while trying to have a genuine conversation underneath it. Here, on his own land with people he trusted, some of that management fell away. He laughed more easily. He argued more readily. He was, she realized on the second evening, watching him across the dinner table as he disputed something Harrison Wells had said with a directness that was completely unguarded. He was happy, simply and without performance happy. She thought, "I want that for him. Whatever happens, I want him to have this." It was the most dangerous thought she'd had yet, because it wasn't about what she wanted for herself anymore. It had moved somewhere past that, into the territory where another person's well-being becomes part of your own internal landscape without your full permission. On the fourth morning, Ashford found her on the east porch before breakfast. She had come out early with her coffee and her thoughts, and he had apparently done the same. "You're up before anyone else," he said, not quite surprised. "I always have been," she said. "I think best before the day starts insisting on things." He settled into the chair beside her. They sat in companionable quiet for a moment. "Are you comfortable?" he asked. Not in the social courtesy sense, in the actual sense. "Yes," she said. "More than I expected." "My mother likes you," he said. "She won't say so directly because saying so directly is not her method. But she asked me last night what your father's name was. She only asks those questions about people she's decided are worth knowing the background of." Clara turned to look at him. "She came to see me before we left Boston." "I know," he said. "She told me." "Did she tell you what she said?" "She told me she went to assess the situation and came back having decided you were her word formidable." The corner of his mouth shifted. "That's the highest compliment she gives. She gave it to Harrison when she first met him. She's given it to 3 people in my memory." Clara looked at her coffee. "She also told me," Ashford continued more carefully, "that she asked whether you loved me, and what you answered." The morning air was warm and still. Clara felt the quiet weight of the moment. "I told her the truth," she said. "I know you did," he said. "That's why I'm mentioning it." He paused. "I want to tell you something, and I want to say it plainly without the kind of language that makes people feel they need to respond a certain way." Clara set her cup down and looked at him directly. "I have been in this conversation with you," Ashford said, "for approximately 6 weeks. I am aware that is not a long time. I am aware that there are people who would say it is not enough time to be certain of anything. He looked at her steadily. But I am 37 years old, and I have been waiting a long time for something I could not have named until recently. And what I've found is that the thing I was waiting for is not a feeling exactly. It's more like recognition. The sense of encountering someone whose mind and whose character are familiar in a way that time doesn't fully account for. Clara held herself very still. "I'm not asking you for anything this morning," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking for a response or a commitment or a declaration. I'm telling you this because honesty was the one promise I made you, and I intend to keep it. And the honest thing is this: I know what I want. I've known it for a while, but I understand that what you need is time, and I can give you that." She looked at him for a long moment. The kind of long moment she had once thought she was too old for, the kind that has weight and texture and will be remembered precisely. "You're a very unusual man," she said finally. "So, I've been told," he said. Generally not as a compliment. "It is one," she said. They sat together until the house began to wake up around them, and then they went in to breakfast, and Clara carried the conversation inside her chest like something she was being careful with, something fragile and new that she hadn't yet decided what to do with, but that she was absolutely certain she did not want to drop. The letter arrived on the 5th day. It was addressed to Ashford, delivered by a writer who had come up from Boston. Clara only knew about it because she saw his face when he returned from his study an hour after excusing himself from the afternoon gathering, and what she saw there stopped her cold. Not distress exactly. Something more controlled than that. But underneath the control, something that had shifted. Harrison Wells saw it too. He appeared at Ashford's shoulder within minutes with the quiet efficiency of a man who has known his friend long enough to recognize the specific texture of trouble. Ashford handed Wells the letter without a word. Wells read it. His expression did something careful and controlled. "Who is Cornelius Brand?" Clara asked. She had crossed the room without quite deciding to. She said it quietly, so only the two of them heard. Ashford looked at her. "An old associate of my father's, a man with commercial interests that occasionally overlap with mine." He paused. "And apparently a correspondent of your brother's." The cold came back. The specific cold she had felt in the library when Aunt Abigail had told her about the first letter. "What does he say?" she asked. Ashford handed her the letter. She read it in under a minute. Then she read it again more slowly, because her mind had skipped over the central paragraph the first time, in the way minds do when information is too significant to absorb at full speed. Cornelius Brand wrote with the smooth, precise malice of a man who has practiced the art of delivering destruction in the language of concern. He wrote that he felt it his duty as an old friend of the Ashford family to share certain information about the Whitcomb land that had not been disclosed in the formal negotiation. He wrote that there was an existing lien against the eastern acreage, a debt obligation from the late elder Whitcomb that had never been formally settled, which would complicate any clean transfer of title. He wrote that he had this information from Nathaniel Whitcomb himself, who had in a private conversation expressed his expectation that the Ashford family's interest in the Whitcomb family, broadly speaking, might incline them toward overlooking the irregularity. Clara read that last sentence twice. Her brother had told Brand about her in Ashford, had used it, had implied to a man with commercial leverage over both families that Ashford's personal interest in Clara might make him willing to absorb a bad deal, had effectively put a price on whatever was developing between them and offered it as a negotiating chip. She set the letter down. "He told Brand," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "He told him that you might be that your interest in me might make you pliable." "Yes," Ashford said. "He used me," she said. Not a question. "He attempted to," Ashford said. Past tense. She looked up at him. "The lien," Wells said from beside them, his tone precise and practical, "can be verified or disproven within a week. If it exists, it's a legitimate complication. If it doesn't, Brand is speculating on false information your brother gave him." "And if it does exist?" Clara asked. Wells glanced at Ashford. Then the negotiation adjusts. It doesn't collapse. That's not what concerns me, Clara said. She looked at Ashford directly. What concerns me is that my brother has now put this, whatever this is between us, into the middle of a commercial dispute. He has made it a factor. He has made me a factor. And you cannot now make any decision about the land without it being readable as either influenced by your feelings toward me or deliberately contrary to them. He has removed the clean space between us. Ashford held her gaze. He tried to remove it, he said. He hasn't succeeded. How can you say that? The moment you decide anything about that land, people will be looking at this. She gestured between them and drawing conclusions. Let them draw conclusions, he said. Nathaniel. Clara. It was the first time he had used her given name without the miss before it. It landed with a weight she hadn't expected. I have been managing other people's conclusions about my decisions my entire adult life. I am not going to let your brother's interference become the reason we stop having an honest conversation. He took a breath. The lien is a business matter. Wells and my attorneys will look into it, and we will handle it appropriately. Whatever your brother told Brand, whatever Brand told me, the business will be resolved on its merits. He paused. This is separate. It doesn't feel separate, she said. I know, he said. That's what he intended. She turned away from them both. She walked to the window and stood there, not looking at anything outside it, just holding the solid fact of the window frame under her hand. Her brother had done this deliberately and cleverly. He had found the one way to make her question everything, not her own judgment of Ashford's character, but the structural possibility of anything clean happening between them. Even if Ashford was exactly who he appeared to be, even if every instinct she had was right, Nathaniel had introduced a contamination into the situation that couldn't be entirely removed. Every choice Ashford made from this point would be interpreted through the lens of what he felt for her. Every accommodation would look like sentiment. Every firm stance would look like overcompensation. Her brother had not ended the thing between them. He had done something more sophisticated than that. He had made it impossible for it to be simple. I should go back to Boston, she said. No, Ashford said. She turned around. His voice had been quiet and immediate, and he was standing very still, and there was something in his expression she had not seen before, not the controlled, measured composure she had come to recognize, but something underneath it, something that was just barely not concealed. If you leave now, he said, you're doing exactly what he wants. You're removing yourself. You're deciding for both of us that this is too complicated to survive. Isn't it? She asked, and her voice cracked very slightly on the last word, just enough to hear. He crossed the room. He didn't touch her. He stood close enough that she was entirely aware of him, but he kept his hands at his sides, and he looked at her with the kind of steadiness that is not distance, that is in fact the opposite of distance. I have spent, he said very quietly, 15 years making careful decisions, safe decisions, decisions that could not be criticized because they were structurally impeccable. I have run a business and managed a family legacy and attended every required social engagement, and I have been by every external measure a responsible and successful man. He paused. And I have been profoundly, quietly, consistently lonely. She held his gaze. You are the first person in 15 years, he said, who has made me forget to be careful. And I am not going to let your brother or Brand or my mother or the entire city of Boston take that from me without a fight. Another pause. Stay, please. The please was the thing that undid her, not the speech, though it had moved through her like a current. The please, said plainly without pride, softening it without the careful management of vulnerability she had come to expect from powerful men. Just please. Wells had quietly left the room. Clara registered this distantly. If I stay, she said, it has to be because I've decided this is worth the complication. Not because you've convinced me, not because leaving feels like giving your brother a victory, because I've actually decided it. Yes, Ashford said. That's exactly the right reason. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the card. She thought about the gallery. She thought about a woman in a portrait with composed hands and what it meant to have stopped apologizing for taking up space. She thought about 15 years of making herself small and quiet and convenient, and how none of it had protected her from anything that mattered. She thought about please. "All right," she said. "I'll stay." Something in his face changed. Released, she thought, was the word. Like a structure that had been holding a great deal of weight had just been allowed to set it down. "Thank you," he said. They stood there for another moment. Then Wells reappeared in the doorway with the natural timing of a man who has calculated exactly how long to give people. "I've sent a note to my attorney in Boston," he said. "We'll have a clear picture of the lien situation by end of week." He looked between them. "In the meantime, my wife is asking where everyone has gone, and dinner will be ready in an hour, and I suggest we all go be unremarkable for an evening." Clara nearly laughed. It came out as a breath, not quite a laugh, but close. "Yes," she said. "That sounds like exactly what I need." She did not know yet that end of week would bring a piece of information that Cornelius Brand had not included in his letter because he had not known it himself, a document buried in the elder Whitcomb's papers that would change the nature of the lien entirely and expose the specific chain of decisions that had buried it. She did not know that the document would carry her brother's signature. She did not know that by the time she learned this, she would be facing not just her brother's interference, but a room full of Boston's most prominent commercial families who had been invited by Brand through channels she hadn't traced yet to a dinner at which certain information about the Whitcomb estate was going to be made public. She only knew that she was staying, and that for the first time in 15 years, the decision she had made was entirely uncomplicated and completely her own. That was enough. For tonight, that was everything. The document arrived on Friday morning, delivered by Wells's attorney, in a leather satchel that the man carried with the careful posture of someone transporting something significant. Wells read it first. Then he handed it to Ashford without a word. Ashford read it standing in the study doorway. Clara watched his face move through 3 distinct expressions in the space of 30 seconds: recognition, understanding, and then a cold, controlled anger that was more alarming than any shouting would have been. He handed it to Clara. She read it in under 2 minutes. It was a promissory note, dated 4 years prior. Signed by Nathaniel Whitcomb, her brother, acknowledging receipt of a private loan from Cornelius Brand against the security of the eastern acreage. The lien was not a ghost from her father's estate. It was not an old forgotten obligation from a man who had died without settling his accounts. It was her brother's debt, his signature, his decision. Made 4 years ago without telling anyone, and buried in the estate papers under her father's name. He had borrowed against land that was not fully his to borrow against. He had used her father's legacy as collateral for his own obligation. And when the Ashford negotiation had opened the possibility of a sale that would expose the lien, he had done 2 things. Simultaneously, tried to poison Clara's relationship with Ashford to prevent the sale, and then used Brand to make the lien look like something it wasn't. She set the document down on the desk. "He borrowed the money 4 years ago," she said. Her voice was very steady. "That's when Father had been dead less than 2 years. The estate wasn't fully settled yet." "No," Wells said quietly. "It wasn't. He was afraid the settlement process would expose it, so he kept it buried." She paused. "And when the Ashford negotiation began, he realized that a proper title search would find it, so he needed to either stop the sale or control the narrative around the lien." "Both," Ashford said. His voice was even. "He tried both." Clara looked at the document again. Her father's name was on the estate header. Her brother's name was on the signature line. 15 years of her life were in the space between those 2 names. 15 years during which she had lived in that house, managed that household, made herself useful and undemanding and small, while her brother had been quietly leveraging her inheritance to cover his own debts. "He never intended to tell me," she said. "No," Ashford said. "If you hadn't begun the negotiation, if the title hadn't been examined, you would never have known," Wells said, gently but plainly. She nodded once. She pressed her hand flat against the desk. The gesture she always returned to when the ground under her shifted, and held it there until the steadiness returned to her chest. "What happens now?" she asked. "Brand's position collapses," Wells said. He presented the lien as an undisclosed complication from the elder Whitcomb's estate. "This document shows it's your brother's personal debt, which changes the legal character of it entirely. Brand either didn't know the distinction or chose not to make it. Either way, his leverage disappears." "And the dinner Brand arranged?" Clara asked. Wells and Ashford exchanged a look. "That," Ashford said carefully, "is the part we need to discuss." She had known about the dinner for 2 days. Dorothea Wells had heard through her Boston network that Cornelius Brand had arranged a gathering at the Merchant Exchange, ostensibly a summer social occasion for prominent commercial families, but structured in a way that suggested an agenda. Brand had mentioned in his invitations that there would be some discussion of pending land transactions of mutual interest. 14 families had accepted. The dinner was scheduled for the following Tuesday in Boston. "He intends to make the lien public," Clara said, "at a dinner full of the people whose opinion matters most to your commercial reputation. He's going to present it as an undisclosed irregularity in the Whitcomb estate, make it look like you were misled or worse, that you knew and proceeded anyway." "Yes," Ashford said. "Can you stop it?" "I could withdraw from the dinner," Ashford said, "which would look like retreat, or I could attend and manage the information directly." "If you attend," Clara said, "and the document surfaces, it exposes my brother completely." "Yes," Ashford said. "It does." The silence in the room had a particular texture, the kind that comes when two people have arrived at the edge of a decision that cannot be made for each other. "He's your brother," Ashford said. "Not mine. The decision about what to do with this document is partly yours." She looked at him. "You would let me have that," she said, "even though it directly affects your negotiation, your reputation." "It affects both of us," he said. "That means both of us decide." She looked at the document for a long time. She thought about Nathaniel, not the man in the library doorway with the cold manufactured fury, but the boy she had grown up beside, who had carried her on his back across the creek behind the Concord estate when she was 6 years old, and he was 10, and the water was too high for her to wade through. She thought about grief doing strange things to people. She thought about a man who had inherited a legacy he wasn't fully equipped to carry, and had made a bad decision in a frightened moment 4 years ago, and had then spent those 4 years constructing defenses around it instead of telling the truth. She thought about all of that. And then she thought about 15 years of borrowed time and manufactured smallness and a letter full of lies sent to a man who had done nothing except look at her clearly. "We go to the dinner," she said, "with the document, and we tell the truth." Ashford nodded. "All of it?" he asked. "All of it," she said. "My brother made his choices. I've made mine." They returned to Boston on Saturday. Aunt Abigail was waiting at the Concord house, with the particular alert stillness of a woman who has been monitoring the situation from a distance and has things to say. Clara told her everything before she'd taken off her traveling coat. Aunt Abigail listened without interrupting, which was notable because she was not generally a woman who found interruption difficult to resist. When Clara finished, her aunt was quiet for a long moment. "Your brother is in his study," she said finally. "He's been there most of the day. He knows the attorney went to Salem." Clara went upstairs, washed her face, and put on clean clothes. Then she went to her brother's study and knocked once and opened the door. Nathaniel was at his desk. He looked up when she entered, and she saw in his face, before the defensive mask came down, something she hadn't seen there in a long time. Fear. Not the manufactured kind, the real kind. "Clara," he started. "Don't," she said. She sat down across from him and set the copy of the promissory note on the desk between them. "Just don't." He looked at it. He didn't touch it. "I can explain," he said. "I know you can," she said. "You're very good at explaining things." You explained me into instability to a man you'd never met. You explained a personal debt into a legacy complication. You're an excellent explainer, Nathaniel. What I want from you right now is not an explanation." He looked up at her. "What do you want?" "I want to know," she said, "whether any part of you understands what you did. Not the business decisions, the rest of it, the letters, the things you said about me to people who had no reason to question them." He was quiet for a moment that felt very long. "I was afraid," he said finally. His voice was stripped of its usual precision. It sounded for the first time in years like the voice of someone who wasn't performing. "If Ashford bought the land and cleared the title properly, the debt came out. And I thought if he had a reason to be careful of the family, a personal reason, he might—" "Let it go," Clara said. "Let it go quietly, yes. And the letter about my instability." A longer pause. I panicked. "You lied," she said. "About me. To a man who had given me no reason to expect protection, and every reason to trust what he was told by my own family. You handed him a reason to walk away from me, Nathaniel, and you did it deliberately." He had no answer for that. He looked at the desk. "I'm going to the Brand dinner on Tuesday," Clara said, "with Nathaniel Ashford. We're bringing the document." Her brother's head came up sharply. "Clara, the truth is going to be in that room one way or another," she said. "Brand is planning to make the lien public as leverage. If we're not there with the full picture, his version is the only version. So we're going." "You'll ruin me," he said. She felt the words hit. She let herself feel them without flinching. "You made choices," she said quietly. "Those choices have consequences. I'm not going to that dinner to ruin you. I'm going because my name has been used as a bargaining chip in a room full of people who will form opinions of me regardless, and I intend to be present when those opinions are formed." She stood up. "If you want any say in how this evening goes, I'd suggest you think carefully between now and Tuesday about what a man who has genuinely made mistakes sounds like when he owns them." She walked out. Aunt Abigail was in the hallway. Clara kept walking. "Well done," her aunt said quietly to her back. Clara went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and allowed herself finally to feel the full weight of everything that had accumulated over the past 6 weeks. The gallery, the card, the coffee house, Salem, the document, the dinner still ahead. The specific exhaustion of being a woman who had spent 15 years being managed by people who claimed to care about her welfare while systematically limiting her options. She let herself feel all of it. For about 10 minutes. Then she straightened her back, picked up her pen, and wrote a note to Ashford confirming Tuesday. His reply came within 2 hours. He would collect her at 6. He had spoken with his attorney. He had also, he wrote in the final line, spoken with his mother, who had said, and he was quoting directly, that it was about time someone showed up to that kind of dinner with the actual facts. Clara read that last line and laughed for the first time in days. It came out fully genuinely, without any of the careful management she usually applied to her own expressions of feeling. Aunt Abigail, passing the doorway, heard it and smiled to herself and kept walking. Tuesday arrived the way consequential days always do, with the same light and weather as ordinary ones, with no particular acknowledgement from the world that something significant is about to occur. Ashford collected her at 6. He was composed and precise and looked at her when she came down the stairs with an expression that said he saw her clearly and was not going anywhere. "Ready?" he said. "No," she said honestly, "but we're going anyway." He almost smiled. "That's the right answer." The Merchant Exchange dining room held 40 people when Clara and Nathaniel Ashford walked in together. She felt the room recalibrate the moment they entered, that familiar, low-frequency shift of social attention, but different this time. Larger. More charged. Because she was on his arm publicly in a room that contained the full weight of Boston's commercial society, and everyone present had clearly been expecting something this evening, but was not certain anymore what shape it would take. Cornelius Brand was across the room. He saw them immediately. He went very still in the way of a man who has set a trap and watched his intended quarry walk directly toward it with an expression of perfect composure. He had not expected her to come. That Clara understood was his critical miscalculation. He had assumed that a woman with her social position and her history of making herself small would not walk into a room like this one. He had assumed she would stay home. He had assumed the evening would proceed with Ashford defending himself alone against a narrative that Nathaniel Whitcomb's panic and Brand's leverage had constructed. He had not accounted for the possibility that she would show up. They greeted people. Ashford introduced her without qualification, not as Nathaniel Whitcomb's sister, not with the careful social hedging that would have indicated uncertainty about her status in his life. He said her name and stood beside her, and that was its own statement, delivered with the quiet clarity of a man who had decided. Harrison Wells arrived 20 minutes later with his wife and gave Clara a look across the room that communicated about 9 distinct things, all of them supportive. Dinner was served. Brand made his move, during the third course, stood called for attention, and began speaking in the smooth, regretful language of a man presenting a concern for the general welfare of the assembled parties. He spoke about the pending Whitcomb land transaction. He spoke about the lien. He described it as an undisclosed irregularity that the Ashford family deserved to have full information about before proceeding. He was very good at it. Clara could see why her brother had believed he was a useful ally. Ashford let him finish. Then he stood up. "I appreciate Mr. Brand's concern," he said. His voice was even and carried easily through the room without effort. "And I want to confirm that we are indeed fully informed about the lien in question." He paused. "In fact, we have the original document that created it." He set the copy on the table. Wells, who had positioned himself strategically, ensured that the men nearest him could see it clearly. "The lien against the Eastern Whitcomb acreage," Ashford continued, "is not a legacy obligation from the late Elder Whitcomb. It is a personal promissory note signed 4 years ago by Nathaniel Whitcomb the Younger against a private loan from Mr. Brand himself." He looked directly at Brand. "Which means Mr. Brand has been presenting a debt he personally holds as a third-party irregularity in a room full of business associates while advocating for his own financial interest. I'll leave everyone to assess what that represents." The room was extremely quiet. Brand's face had gone through several colors. "As for the Whitcomb transaction," Ashford said, "the lien will be settled at closing, as is standard practice. The title will be clean. The deal proceeds." He looked around the room with the calm authority of a man entirely at home in himself. "I believe we were on the third course. I apologize for the interruption." He sat down. Clara's hand was in her lap under the table. She pressed it flat against her knee and held it there. Margaret Wells leaned across the table and said very quietly, "You are both extraordinary." Clara looked at her. "He is," she said. "You walked in," Margaret said simply. "That was half of it. You showed up." Across the table she met Ashford's eyes. He was speaking to someone on his left, but he glanced at her in the middle of it just briefly, just long enough, and what was in his expression was not triumph. It was something quieter and more important than triumph. It was relief. The specific relief of a man who has stood in a room where he might have been alone and found that he was not. Brand left early. No one watched him go. Her brother was not at the dinner. But he heard about it. The whole city heard about it in the particular rapid way of communities, small enough for information to travel, but large enough to generate a crowd when it arrives. Nathaniel Whitcomb came to her 3 days later. Not with fury this time. Not with the manufactured cold precision she had learned to brace for. He came in the morning to the library, and he sat down across from her, like a man whose armor has been removed, and who is still figuring out how to occupy space without it. "I'm going to settle the debt," he said. "I've spoken to Brand. I've made arrangements." "Good," Clara said. I want to." He stopped, started again. "I know what I did was wrong. To you. Not the money. The rest of it." She looked at her brother for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "It was." "I don't know how to ask you to forgive that," he said. "You don't ask," she said. "You make different choices going forward. That's how it works." He nodded. He looked at his hands. "Ashford is a good man." "He is," she said. "Better than I gave you credit for knowing." "Yes," she said simply. "He is." Her brother left without another word. It was not a resolution, not a clean, complete one, the kind that arrives tied with sentiment. It was a beginning. A small, tentative, uncertain beginning between two people who had done each other damage and would have to navigate the distance carefully for a long time. She could work with that. 2 weeks later, on a Sunday morning in early September, Nathaniel Ashford came to the Concord house and asked to speak with her privately. Not in the formal visiting parlor. In the garden where the summer was finally beginning to let go of itself at the edges. He stood with her in the quiet of that early September morning, and he said without preamble or strategic framing that he wanted to marry her. That he was asking not because the summer was ending, or because his mother had set a deadline, or because Boston society required a resolution to the story it had been watching. He was asking because he had spent 45 days in genuine conversation with a woman who had never once performed for him, who had stood beside him in a room designed to diminish her and refused to be diminished, who had looked at a document that damaged her brother and made the harder choice anyway. He was asking because she was, as his mother had accurately identified, formidable. And because formidable was exactly what he had been looking for without knowing the word for it. "I know you've built a life inside your own judgment," he said. "I'm not asking you to replace that. I'm asking you to let me be part of the life it builds." Clara Whitcomb stood in the September garden, 39 years old, unhurried and unafraid, and she looked at this man who had found her in a gallery when she was trying to disappear and had refused consistently and without drama to let her. "Yes," she said. Not because she was grateful. Not because the alternative was loneliness. Not because the summer had run out and practicality demanded a decision. Because she had waited 39 years to be chosen by someone who saw her clearly, and Nathaniel Ashford saw her clearly, and she had earned the right to say yes to that without apology. They were married in October, a small ceremony. 30 guests, no spectacle. Aunt Abigail wept once briefly and denied it afterward with complete conviction. Harrison Wells made a toast that was both funny and genuinely moving. Eleanor Ashford sat in the front row and looked at her son's face during the ceremony and said nothing at all, but her expression said everything. A mother's expression can say when she watches her child become fully, finally, authentically happy. Nathaniel Whitcomb attended. He sat quietly and behaved well and gave his sister's hand to the man beside her with the careful dignity of someone who is still learning what decency looks like when no one is watching. It was enough. It was a start. And Clara Ashford, who had spent 15 years being invisible and 2 months being seen, and the rest of her life being exactly who she had always been, stood in that quiet room and felt not the relief of rescue, but the deep settled satisfaction of a woman who had navigated her own way to solid ground. She had not been saved. She had been recognized. And she had been brave enough finally to recognize herself in return. Some women wait their whole lives to be chosen. Clara Whitcomb waited 39 years, and then she chose herself first, and everything true followed after.